Begin the session.
Yeah.
Welcome to the second technical session on institutional restructuring, effective governance, and leadership. We have in chair for this session Professor Dr. K.K. Agarwal, Chairman NBA, and the speakers are Professor Jaspal Singh Sandhu, Vice Chancellor, Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar, Professor Farkan Kamar, former Secretary General, AIU, and Professor R. Karpaga Kumaravel, Vice Chancellor, Central University of Tamil Nadu. Let me quickly introduce the chair to you, and then I will bring in the panelists for the session. Professor K.K. Agarwal obtained his engineering degree in 1968 and PhD degree in 1975. He served as founder Vice Chancellor of GS Indraprastha University, Delhi for a period of 10 years. He has been president of IETE for a period 2002 and 2004, President Computer Society of India for the period 2007 to 9, and also President Southeast Asia Regional Computer Confederation for 2 years. He was conferred Lifetime Achievement Award by IETE as also by Computer Society of India. He was honored by Reliability Society of IEEE USA and presently serves as Chairman, National Board of Accreditation. Ladies and gentlemen, now let me introduce the first speaker. Professor Jaspal Singh Sandhu, Vice Chancellor, Guru Nanak Dev University, is the first medical doctor to be the Vice Chancellor of Multi-Specialty University in the state of Punjab. He completed his graduation and post-graduation in medicine from Government Medical College, Amritsar. Subsequent to his interest in sports, he joined post-graduation in sports medicine from Netaji Subhash National Institute of Sports, Patiala. For his outstanding contribution to the field of medicine, he was honored as Fellow of National Academy of Medical Sciences. He has more than 200 publications to his credit. He also served as a Secretary of University Grants Commission for over 3 years. He has memberships for more than a dozen professional associations and bodies, besides being the peer reviewer and member of editorial board of numerous international journals. He has been part of the Government of India delegations to Norway, China, Iran, Maldives, and was invited lectures in more than 24 countries. The second speaker in line is Dr. Farkan Kamar, who is presently Professor of Management at the Center of Management Studies, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. He has served as the Secretary General of the Association of Indian Universities, the largest and one of the oldest network universities in the world. In his illustrious career, Dr. Kamar has held the position of the Vice Chancellor of the University of Rajasthan and the Central University of Himachal Pradesh. He has also served as advisor in the Planning Commission of India. Essentially a professor of management, he has keen research interest in public policy, planning, administration, and financing of higher education, and has numerous publications in journals of repute to his credit. Professor Kamar has chaired and been members of a large number of committees, working groups at their national and international level. Dr. Kamar thus brings with him academic eminence, leadership qualities, and exposure to best global practices. Ladies and gentlemen, let me bring in the third speaker to you. Professor Karpaga Kumaravel is presently serving as the Vice Chancellor, Senior Professor and Dean, School of Education and Training, Central University of Tamil Nadu, an awardee of Senior Fulbright and Commonwealth Fellowship. Professor Kumaravel has served successfully in various capacities as Vice Chancellor of a reputed state university between 2008 and 2011. He has a PhD in Education, Specialization Application of Educational Technology. Under Professor Kumaravel's leadership as a project coordinator and head of the Department of Educational Technology has emerged as a first department in educational technology in South India to get the research study status with a special assistance from the UGC, for which he was a project coordinator. As part of the UGC SAP project, he has trained thousands of higher education teachers in education multimedia and e-content development across the country and equipped the department with state-of-the-art facilities. On this note, may I request Professor Agarwal to take the session forward.
Thank you, Dr. Sushma. It's a pleasure to be a part of this session, the South Zone Vice Chancellor's Conference of AIU, with very eminent panelists with me. Friends, this session, which is titled as Institutional Restructuring, Effective Governance and Leadership, is being held in the backdrop of announcement of NEP 2020. And all my eminent panelists and all the member vice chancellors here are very well aware of NEP 2020 with an abundant number of webinars they have delivered or attended. I think NEP clauses are by now memorized by most of you. But the issues are, when we go to implement it, there will be some structural changes required and very strong structural changes required. Without that, it will be very difficult to implement NEP in its spirit. So therefore, I feel this session about institutional restructuring, effective governance and leadership is an essential and very necessary component of implementation of NEP. I thought I'll touch upon a few brief topics very briefly, and then hand it over to my very capable eminent panelists. First is governance at the highest level. We have contemplated Higher Education Commission of India. When does it take birth is still a little unknown fact, but probably very soon it will be delivered. And then the entire governance mechanism of education in the country will go through a change. At the moment, we have UGC, AICTE, NCT, so on and so forth. But with Higher Education Commission of India, all these subject-specific bodies, except with the exception of law and agriculture, for which I really don't have a reason known to me, that short of law and agriculture, everything will be subject independent in the sense that they will be all integrated into Higher Education Commission of India. The division of work is rather in the form of 4 verticals, which will be for regulation, number 1, number 2 for accreditation, number 3 for grants, and number 4 for standard setting. And these 4 verticals will independently look after all institutions in the country. And some basic premises which are being made here are that if these 4 verticals are working independently, then the biases and because at the moment, a grant giving agency also knows what are the weaknesses and things like that. So therefore, that will be independent of the whole thing. These 4 verticals will hopefully work very independently. Accreditation, for that matter, has been stated as accreditation will be the primary means of regulation, because our regulation at the moment is for greenfield universities. Now, for greenfield universities, what can UGC or AICTE really see? Because you just don't have anything except the land and at best first-year buildings or things like that. Therefore, accreditation, which at the moment in the country is being handled by NAAC or NBA, is coming into picture after 2 batches graduate. Therefore, it is expected that most of the things required for a successful professional graduate are in place. All the laboratories are in place, by and large the faculty is in place, and so on and so forth. That is why that assessment, which is 2 years after graduation, will be much more meaningful, much more solid, and therefore we say National Accreditation Council will be the primary method of regulation in the country. Now, having said that, and having assumed that we will be able to accredit 1,000+ universities and 40,000+ colleges, obviously the 2 organizations will not be good enough. Therefore, there is a stipulation that we might create several other accreditation agencies, and what will be their domains, what will be their specific functions is not clear still. But what is clear is that there will be a National Accreditation Council which will rather accredit the accrediting agencies. For example, NAC will decide what should be the process of accreditation, or what should be the basic norms of accreditation, and the present NAC and the present NBA will be 2 of the member agencies of NAC. There may be several others. We do not have an idea of that so far, because if the volume of work like this has to be handled, then many things have to come in. We were just having a talk about governance and autonomy of the universities. Without the autonomy, in the real sense, I personally believe implementing NEP will be almost impossible, because when you talk about bank of credits, credit transfer, student mobility, all these, the flexibility in the course, branchless engineering, and so on and so forth. When you talk about all these, decision taking will have to be taken at a very low level. UGC or HECI will not be able to take centralized decisions for everybody. Even university will not be able to take decision for colleges. Therefore, sooner we de-link affiliation system from the universities or autonomy, because even colleges have to be autonomous if these things have to be implemented. We were just having an informal chat before the session started, and we were talking about autonomy of the university. And I am just reminding my fellow colleagues, I've been told that at least 2 states in India, even the university professors are selected by other than the universities. Bihar and Odisha, I've been told there's a University Service Commission which selects professors for the universities for their states. Now, if that is our implementation of autonomy, I think AIU is very right that somewhere something will have to come in, because we talk about autonomy in 1,000+ webinars, and we have service commissions are selecting professors for the universities. These two phenomena will not be able to go together, I feel. So we'll have to put our card straight and see what do we mean by autonomy and what do we mean by excellence of the universities. Only sentence I would like to make: excellence without autonomy is impossible. And let's make it sure that autonomy at whatever cost will have to be provided. I talked to some vice chancellors and they say, sir, how do I make colleges autonomous? Principals are not responsible. Well, I personally feel that statement should not be acceptable. Even teachers, I've been told, many universities, all of you in the colleges, universities, Professor Furqan Qamar has been at the helm of affairs of AIU for full 5 years, and prior to that many responsible positions. And Dr. Sandhu has been in UGC, which has been a sort of regulation for everything. And now in GNDU also, I was very happy when it was introduced that he's the first doctor to head the multi-faculty university. And I know for sure that he has used his diagnostics and treatment in the university faculties pretty well. And therefore, this experiment is not a bad experiment for the country. We can think of other doctors also who have equally good capabilities of diagnosis and treatment. But having said that, unless we really do diagnostics of the education system with a fair mind, with an unbiased mind, I think many of the things which we'll be talking may not have a meaning. And I, for one, definitely believe autonomy to the universities or the leaders, academic leaders of the universities will have to ensure, and I can definitely make a statement when I look back into the analysis, whether autonomy has been snatched away from the vice chancellors or whether vice chancellors have surrendered autonomy is $1 million question. And I think both are true. So we at least will have to set our house in order and make sure what we want for implementation of NEP. With these initial remarks and knowing my the ideas full in the panelists, I invite the first panelist, my great friend, Professor Jaspal Singh Sandhu, Vice Chancellor of GND University, Amritsar, to make his observations, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Agarwal. Thank you, Dr. Mittal, Dr. Furqan, for inviting me for this session. I'll actually like to start with an anecdote. I recently went to a university in UK. Outside the Vice Chancellor's office, there was a plaque which said that from this particular place, a student stood and threw a stone at the Vice Chancellor's window. So then I asked him, why did he do that? He said he did it because he did his bachelor's from the university, the master's and the PhD. And for this 10 years he's been in the university, he never saw the vice chancellor's face. He was just trying to see how the vice chancellor looks like. That was the kind of a reputation or the kind of silo the vice chancellor used to work in. But things have changed dramatically, sir. I will present my university as a case study, not otherwise, because you talked, lots of them talked about the NEP, lots of them talked about good governance, lots of them talked about the 4 verticals. I think I must have given these 8, 10 of the 20, maybe more than lectures on this itself, but I'm going to just present my own way of working. It may not be the optimal one, but how we could have possibly, how we are managing things here, sir. So this is the first important thing is that every vice chancellor has to get off his high horse and become a chief executive officer of university. He has to be equal or the first among equals as not a vice chancellor anymore. The first and foremost duty of a vice chancellor, any university, maybe central university or a state university, is not actually the policy making, it is to get finances. So that is a major problem. I still remember when we were in UGC, Madam Pankaj and we used to sit together and vice chancellor from Central University come and ask how much money would you give us and how are we going to run the university, and we are always short of money. I'll present the data, sir. In my university, the budget stands today at around 580 crores. But what do I get from the government? I get 49 crores from the government. That's less than 10% of my total budget. So how do I manage it? So when we had joined the university, we had lost a few crores. So we started how can we start getting the things in proper fashion. First and foremost we did was, sir, we centralized the purchase in the sense that we not that vice chancellor does the purchase. We made a centralized purchase committee in which we had people of eminence there. So if a department A had to do a purchase, they would come to centralized purchase committee, and we could give bulk orders. We reduced the price of most of the equipment tremendously. So we saved lots of money on that. The second initiative, we thought that how can we reduce the recurring charges in the university. We went about, sir, we went out for the solar to the Solar Energy Corporation of India, and today we are saving about 4 to 5 crores of rupees every year just from the electricity itself. Here we could not make our things, we could not balance our finances. We had to see that somehow our admission should increase. How could we increase the admission, sir? One was to build up the reputation of the university, see that people are attracted towards it. At present, Nalanda University happens to be the top university of the state of Punjab. This is the only category 1 university in the state of Punjab, sir. The iconic Punjab University happens to be in category 2. And our admissions stand much higher than any other university. So then we started the new departments. We restructured the whole department in such a manner that there was industry partner into it. There was employer, which is part of the board of studies. Without the industry partner and the employer, we would not pass any syllabus. So most of the syllabus were transformed from more of theoretical syllabi to more of a practical syllabi, as desired by the employer and the industry, which were added into the board of studies. Then we started with new departments, which were the ones like data analytics is one of them, agriculture is another one, where lots of people were attracted towards this department. This is the only university in North India in which we have had 34% increase in admission in last 3 years, and that is how we made the money. This is the primary aim we did. Then most of our construction, most of our maintenance, we had to get funds from either central funding agencies, or we had to go to one of the CSR funds of the various industries, or the Illumini to get all the funds. So this is what basically I could understand was that vice chancellor basically primarily is a manager of funds. That's first, if you had the funds, then anything else would happen. Otherwise, we don't have the funds. You may have one of the best universities, it's still going to founder, it's not going to function. Then the most important thing was the perception of university. If they do not increase the perception of university, the things are going to be quite bad for the university. And then we went in for accreditations, we went for category 1, we went for we gradually crawled up from a 200 position in NERF to 51 position last year. So that is how the things started improving. The kind of a perception in the general public went on decreasing. Yes, we use it in a best way. See, education these days is not a service, it's a selling commodity. You have to sell your university, you have to sell your colleges. If you don't sell your college and your university, you do not tend to rise gradually, and your colleges and universities die down. So we had used social media in a big way. We went in for a very overall of the PR department. We presented our facts in a proper manner. All these things, when they happened, gradually our ranking went on increasing, and our perception general public also went on. Next came the students. How do you actually look at the students? How do you feel them? Are they our subordinates, or are they the ones who are getting something from us? No, we are the ones who are getting everything from students. So what if they are students? They are professors. They are professors. There is a vice chancellor. Otherwise, there is no need. They are the primary stakeholders. So we made an open office in the university, and any student can walk into vice chancellor's office without seeking an appointment, and he can wait his turn, but he can give his viewpoints on how to go about improving the university. This is how we started every day afternoon. For the last 3 years, 3 hours are reserved for a student. Even today it was reserved. I just missed on today. It was reserved for students. We get them in batches of about 40, 50. Listen to them, talk to them, and listen about the personal views, listen about how they want the improvement of universities, and encourage them. That's how our connection with the students increased. Now we have 15,000 students in the campus today. I don't think there's a single student who does not know me personally and who has not met me personally. So this is the kind of connection we created. That did a very big thing. So then the students came up with the idea that if studies is one part of it, you can go on studying, you can cram, you can still pass examination. What about cultural activities? What about the about our connection with the society? Then we came in for 7 clubs, and these clubs we did the Go Green Club, the Fitness Club, the Literary Club, the Science Club, and all those things. And all the students gradually, invariably, 90% of them became members of various clubs. This was the one which changed the whole perception of the university. So when we talk of good governance means you have to get off your high horse, has to go to a level of the students, talk to them to the level of the students. Otherwise, if you think that you are the bosses, this thing is not going to happen. Then I tell you another very interesting fact, sir. One day a boy was playing, this is another anecdote, sir. There's one playing a guitar, and he was playing alone, and he was playing it beautifully. So I asked him, why are you playing a guitar alone? He says, I don't have place to play a guitar. Though we have auditoria inside, but they are not open every day. So we made an amphitheater in the most crowded place at the university. And every Wednesday, about 2,000 students get on there, that amphitheater, sit together, run the show themselves. And the starts at 6, finishes at 10, sharp at 10. And it's an open house. It's a kind of a thing that they can talk against the vice chancellor, they can talk against the administration, they can give suggestions, but invariably, I tell you, if you connect with students, none of them are vicious. They're on the whole very good people. So I sit there on Wednesdays also for an hour or so with them, and they invariably, it's the most rewarding time of the day when I sit with those people. That's how we started. Then we may try to find out, because I'm just taking as a case study. So I would like suggestions from you how to go about better to make it a little better. Then, in Delhi, when we were there, we were very much concerned during Diwali time that there was lots of pollution. Though I was staying in one of the good areas in Delhi, in Janakpuri, still you could not breathe on those days. So I thought when I come to Amritsar, it's a small city, it would be better, kind of atmosphere, better air quality. But unfortunately, when we checked it on our monitors, it turned out to be in the orange zone. Then we started putting on display. We put 2 display boards there. We started putting the data every day for the students to see that you are in the orange zone. Then telling them that this is how you're going to kill your lungs. Your lungs are going to get all charcoal black. So kindly do something. So we have banned the vehicles. I think most IITs have also done it. And we have banned the vehicles, 4-wheelers inside the campus. There are 2 big parking lots at both ends of the university where they parked and they walked up. So initially we started the cycling project, which unfortunately, as the things go about it, people in Punjab, they are very, very particular about their, Professor Agrawal would know it. They think that getting on a cycle is getting to a lower level. So somehow that didn't work, it failed. So then again, we thought that how could we, now we have golf carts, 14-seater golf carts running in the university where they get hop off, hop on, wherever they want to without charging a single rupee. Now, in the whole campus itself, people either walk or they use these vehicles. Yes, teachers have not put so far this condition, because teachers, we still allow the cars and 4-wheelers to come into the campus. So this is some subtle things which did a lot of things. Then we thought that how would we make them more aware of good living. the students. So that was one more thing which stuck me always. So I first thing we changed the hostels are not the rooms. We changed their messes, we changed their washrooms. And mind you, the washrooms in my university are as good as the Delhi airport. They are exactly in the same manner as it is in Delhi airport. If you don't tell the students how to live a good life, they normally do not know what is good. So that is that. And gradually, initially, yes, we did have problems because those shutters which were there, they were not properly shut. They were, but mind you, in a year, they were sensitized enough that washrooms are as now the whole campus is we are changing them to one of the best. So this is how things have gradually improved. We made it a zero discharge campus. We upgraded the botanical garden. We make it the way the walking track there. So let it be something that people can go around and they be happy that they're part of this university. But then I found out one particular day that lots of boys and girls are walking outside towards the thing and asking that. I asked them, "Where are you going?" They said, "We're going to gym." Then we followed Mahe. If anybody has gone to Mahe in money and there's gym that is probably the best gym you have in the country. Then we followed them up. We made the gym, which is probably the best in any public university in the country. We earn money out of it. We don't give it free. It helps in our maintenance, but it also is a kind of safety which provided to the students. That is how the graduate things went on going. So then we started asking them how could you go about improving your IT. And we started with, we are the first university again to start with e-office. Technically, we are going to make it a paperless university in a very short time. We already started it, again saving lots of money in that. So ultimately, again, boils down to finances. As the finances, are there, as you get to go about it, you do well. Professor Agarwal talked about autonomy, and he was very rightly pointed out either we have sacrificed autonomy or there is stage for us. It's a $1 million question. But I tell you one thing, sir, and what we did when we did selection of lectures, assistant professors here and the associate professors, they put cameras with recording. Whenever the person is waiting for an interaction, everything is recorded, put in public domain. We have no cases, and there's no resentment. And when you get it, not that I don't get political push and pulls, but when you tell them that it's going to get recorded and it will put in public domain, 99% of politicians do not even talk to you second time. So this is innovation. This is how the things have happened. This is how the things have changed. Regarding the restructuring of universities, sir, in my opinion, making a multidisciplinary universities and this, it's going to be lots and lots of finance and lots of funds and lots of time. I still remember when we started CBCS, Madam Mittal and myself, we really worked on that. The CBCS system was introduced in a very, and Professor Furqan Kamra was part of it, and still, can you beat it? Not all Delhi colleges have a CBCS system. Not all courses in my college universities have CBCS system. It's taken such a long time, 4 years, 5 years, to really and go about making change. Higher education is like aircraft is aircraft carrier. So you can't change it 100. It's not a speedboat. You can't change 180 degrees. You have to gradually shift 10 degrees, 5 degrees, and then gradually you end up with the good thing. So this NEP on the whole has given us a structure how to go about it. But on the whole, I think it's going to take lots of finance, lots of effort on the part of the vice chancellors and the people who are the academic administrators to make a change over the period of next 10, 15, 20 years. It's not going to happen immediately. That's my point. Regarding the verticals, sir, you were very rightly pointed out regarding the verticals. I still remember that I have a little bit of reservations on that, which I should not be speaking on this occasion, but I do have a reservation, sir. The only, you can say, a danda we had in a hand to ensure the university follows the regulations of the University Grants Commission was the finances. If the finances are dislinked, they are delinked from regulation, who are going to agree to your regulations? It's going to be $1 million question, sir, because unless until people have something, if you give them a penal powers to Heki, or you will see that another problem will start. So there has to be, still have to fine tune the whole method. It can't be that you just take 4 verticals and finish with it and say that is done. That is a good thing. Yes, you're delinking accreditation and finances and regulation has to be done, but there has to be some congruence in the whole thing. That's the kind of of that does not come. Already UGC is primarily, the act of UGC is not bad on the whole, but it is toothless. Lots of times this have been, we could not penalize the university. We cannot force a regulation. We can only request. I hope that when this HECI comes up, it is not toothless as UGC is. So this is one of the questions which I always, because I working in UGC for 3.5 long years, I've seen that you have to have something in your hand to force the people to follow the rules and regulations of government of I think that's just a case study, sir, how we went about it, how we did the things. So there's some good points, some bad points. I lost on some, gained on some, but on the whole, and the end of the day, sir, we could bring the university to level that it is ranked as top in North India, and we are one of the 10 universities funded by RUSA, being the top 10 state public universities for 100 crores. So that means our ranking over the time in state public universities has gone up. Yes, there is a big dearth of good academic administrators. They did start the program training them, people with 10 years experience, and they were sent for training to various universities abroad and IITs and TES and whatnot and central universities. But sir, it is the fire in you which actually brings the change. It's not that you can't train a person. Training may help 10%, 5%. The fire has to be there to make a change. And I think that the first and foremost which AIU should put, and Madam Mittal is herself very particular about it, that we should put a kind of recommendation that the selection committee of vice chancellor should be very much above board, and the person only with the fire in the belly should be the ones selected as vice chancellors. Not it is a person may be very good in academics, he may write good papers, but he may still be not a good administrator. So this aspect has to be looked into. Unless you get good academic administrators, I don't think subsequent university system in the country is going to go for a sea change. Yes, if they are good on the whole, then gradually you can think for better things. Yes, checks and balances have to be done by various agencies of which we are going to create the 4 verticals. But on the whole, sir, it is the vice chancellor leader which has to take the person ahead, but he has to get off the high horse. He has to be a CEO. He cannot be vice chancellor anymore. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Professor Sandhu, for very nice observations and case study of your university. I think the highlights, first is proper choice of a vice chancellor is $1 million question. And I think, but one day we'll have to face it, because I agree, and I think everybody will agree, unless you have a leadership in the vice chancellor, no amount of regulations or policies will be able to make the university give that advantage. And we have to work seriously on that direction. Second thing which you may have emphasized, in addition to the very innovative steps you have taken, is that the vice chancellor has to be first amongst equals. I think that's again where we have lost. I'm sorry to say, even amongst our own professors, some of them, when they become vice chancellors, they become administrators like DCs and SPs. Now that's, I've been telling many of them, first of all, you plead that only professors should be vice chancellors, and then you start behaving like non-professors. So that is not an academic leadership of the university. So I fully agree, and I think many of us will agree and will work in that direction. Thank you very much. And I next invite Professor Furqan Qamar, an excellent friend at a personal level, and very eminent career in being vice chancellor of a couple of universities and steering AIU just before Dr. Pankaj Mittal had taken over for 5 years. And personally, I'm aware of many initiatives taken therein. So I'll request Professor Furqan Qamar to make his observations, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Congratulations to you, Dr. Mittal, and the president of the AIU for continuing the conferences of the Vice Chancellor despite all the constraints of the COVID that we presently have. And I am aware that these zonal meets of the Vice Chancellors are major milestones because the AIU can lead only when it has knowledge of what is happening at the grassroots levels. So these zonal meets and the national meets are that source which equip AIU with the necessary information. So congratulations to you, Dr. Mittal, and to your whole team for carrying it forward. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity and asking me to speak in this very important session, particularly the one which is being chaired by Professor Agrawal and co-panelists like Vice Chancellor of a premier university, and then Professor Sandhu, a good friend, and who has been Secretary of the University Grants Commission. There are just a couple of things that I want to mention here in the 10 minutes time that I have at my disposal. So one change that I'm seeing in the higher education sector is that there is no resistance to change. Like when Professor Sandhu was speaking, he started by saying that the university gets, even though it's a public funded state university, it gets 10% of what it needs and what its budget is. And even then, he has embraced changes and has been able to carry forward not only what has been going on, but has also been able to take decisions. Similarly, a couple of last week, I was at Lucknow University, and it was the same story which the Vice Chancellor shared. Just 35 crores out of more than 400 crores of budget he is getting from the state government, but then the lack of the funds has in no way deterred the Vice Chancellor from taking initiative. Similarly, a number of new initiatives have been proposed by the National Education Policy and so on. So I see an overall environment and a climate where people are reconciled to the idea that the changes which are being suggested from above are to be accepted and to be implemented, and there is no resistance to all. It means if the national education policy somehow is not implemented fully and in totality, that will not be because of the resistance from the leadership of the academic institutions or from the faculty, etc. So there is a total environment of acceptability. Higher education, I have been saying, has been subject to a number of uncertainties. And one of the most recent uncertainties that has been introduced in the system is, I'm not mentioning about COVID because COVID is a different kind of uncertainty, is the uncertainty caused by the policy changes that are going to take place. And my feeling is that the longer it takes to implement those changes that have become a kind of law of the land or a policy, the system is likely to remain uncertain. So say, for example, at the institutional level, and I'm talking about the university level, the national education policy has prescribed that now the academic institutions will be classified into 3 categories: the research universities, teaching universities, and autonomous higher educational institutions. Now, this definition of these 3 universities and the benchmark and the criteria for classifying these institutions should become known to all higher education institutions as soon as it can be. Otherwise, the system would continue to languish. The second institutional change that policy talks about, and which to my mind has been a need and requirement for almost past 100 years, but this time the education policy has taken the plunge to take that decision, and this is about the affiliation system. Right from the very beginning, and we know that in India, the college system is older then the university system. Colleges came into existence first, followed by universities. And immediately after the establishment of universities, many different commissions and committees have been talking about that this affiliation system is not a good system of providing higher education. For example, Radhakrishnan Commission went into this detail, and this also said that this affiliation system is a burden on the university and the quality is also not there. And most critically, the affiliation system as such impinges on the autonomy of the higher educational institution, which Professor Agrawal has been talking about. So like colleges have power to teach, to organize teaching, but they do not have power to evaluate their students. It's assumed that perhaps they are not capable or competent of. So people have been talking about, but every time, every committee, after having detailed discussion, they reached to the conclusion that it may not be possible to do away with colleges. And therefore, they must continue. Over the past 15, 16 years, a number of changes were brought in, like, okay, we can't do away with colleges, but we can reduce the number of colleges which are affiliated to a university, and to a large extent, UGC and the other institutions have been successful in this regard. So bulk of the universities today have about 100 colleges. But now the National Education Policy has taken the decision that there shall not be this system of providing higher education. Now there are two uncertainties that have been brought in, and I think the higher education system need to be ready to brace for this. One, are these colleges ready and equipped to take the role to become independent, autonomous higher educational institutions, to engage in teaching, to do the evaluation, and to award degrees? And the second uncertainty, that for many universities, these affiliated colleges have been the source of the major revenue. When you find that out of a budget of 400 crores, you get only 40 crores from the state government, the question is that from where this 350 crore was coming. And this was coming from the self-financing courses, but majorly they were coming as affiliation fees, examination fees, and various kinds of penalties imposed on the colleges. So when these colleges are severed from the universities, what will happen to the budgets of the universities and how will they survive and manage? And I think the universities need to think about them. So the criteria for classifying universities and readiness to see the effect of this change in the affiliation system and being ready to run their house in such a manner that the essential purpose of the universities are continued. The third thing is about a number of restructuring, fundamental restructuring that the policy has suggested at the level of the programs and in terms of the size of the institutions. So the policy is about increasing the size of the institutions. The policy is about making all higher educational institutions multidisciplinary. The policy is about making all the programs modular and the other things. All of these are excellent ideas, very good ideas, but they will all cost money. For example, these things cannot be steered, or these policy changes cannot be steered on the basis of the guest part-time kind of teachers. You require full-time faculty, and somehow that has been one sticky issue, that on an average 45 to 50% of the faculty positions across all higher educational institutions have continued to remain vacant despite all these communication. And one of the major reasons is that even when the regulators say that fill up all faculty positions, the financial positions on the ground is such that the universities themselves find it difficult to meet the expenses if they fill up all faculty positions. I think this issue need to be addressed very, very seriously. Lastly, since I have only 10 minutes, there are a number of structural changes which Professor Agarwal has so ably highlighted at the regulatory level. That instead of multiplicity of the regulatory agencies, one regulatory bodies. But we have already made an exception that health education would be away from this commission. And within health education, we thought that the Medical Commission of India would take care of all health education. But now we know that there is a separate commission for Ayush, separate commission for homeopathy, separate commission for nursing. All of these are coming in. And therefore, that is making people ask this question that if in medical education you need separate regulatory bodies for the allied disciplines, can a single regulator be sufficient for higher education, which is so diverse? And earlier people were reconciled to this idea, but now they are asking these questions. But anyway, so health education is away. Law education is separate from the health education. So the whole idea of a single regulatory bodies is not going to happen. It means the existing troubles that the universities had, that if it's a multidisciplinary university, you have faculty of law, you have medical sciences, and you have 2-3 branches of the medical sciences, then you will continue to be getting separate regulators knocking at your door, and you would be required to meet their requirements. Finally, one major change that has been suggested is that the benchmarking and the accreditation is moving away from the 2 government-owned autonomous bodies, government-owned independent societies, to multidisciplinary agencies. I think we will have to be extremely careful about ensuring that these regulatory bodies for accreditation which comes up, their credibility is in no way dented. This is one. And the second issue that I would like to highlight is that accreditation is not only for benchmarking, but it is also a huge business. Even the 2 governmental agencies which are into the accreditation today, they make huge sums of money by way of fees of accreditation that they charge. And I think this is one motivation for many of the private organizations wanting to enter into the accreditation business. Presently, the system is all governmental owned, so no individual stands to benefit. But in fact, the possibility of individuals maximizing their profit through accreditation business would go a big way. And in fact, though the education shall continue to remain in not-for-profit activities, but many educational allied activities would in fact become the profit-making. So I think one responsibility that will come on the National Accreditation Council, which is going to be the umbrella body, is to see that the benchmark for the entry of such accrediting agencies are very strict. The framework for the accreditation is very transparent and objective, and the profit motives must be determined, and therefore they should be able to cover only the cost of accreditation by way of fees that they charge from the institution. Ultimately, otherwise, what will happen is that institutions do not have money of their own. Whatever they pay to any institution, that is all passed on to the students. So the more costs you add, the more education is going to be expensive, and this will be very, very harmful as far as the equity and social justice in higher education is concerned. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I only indicated what I thought was necessary. Given the time, I'll be very willing to share some more ideas. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Professor Furqan Kama, for very incisive remarks. You have all the knowledge and the data and have been writing on various subjects, so have an in-depth grip of the things. So made very, very important points. But the most optimistic point is that there's less resistance to change now. Otherwise, academic world has been known for resistant to change for whatever reason. It's a positive thing that there's a less resistance to change. Reasons may be anything. Uncertainties in system would remain, but you're very right. Uncertainty to be converted into certainty, the only method is to take a decision. Whether the decision is right or wrong, history will tell, but let's take a decision and move forward. Then you raised a very important question on full-time faculty, which is a cost factor and which has to be provided for. And you're delinking colleges from the universities, thereby starving the universities of funds, is again a very important point that somewhere it will have to be supported, because we cannot, but personally I feel a bad academic system should give way to system, and we should find finances for this. And as Dr. Sandhu said, that they can find several methods. Affiliation of colleges is one, but then few other things also, thoda thoda karke, which they are doing something. Then next speaker is our eminent colleague, Professor Karparga Kumaravel, officiating Vice Chancellor of University of Tamil Nadu. He is a very senior professor from the field of education. So from medical science, we moved to management, and now we move to education. So that way the panel is a very diversified panel. And I just read that he had contributed a lot of innovative things to the field of education in this country. And Professor Sandhu will agree with me, one course which took the highest beating in this country was B.Ed course. Because, I mean, people made experiments with B.Ed like anything. I was ashamed as a academician of this country when somebody came to me, sir, I have a big bungalow, garage is lying vacant, can I start a B.Ed course? Now, if that was the aspiration of the people for the B.Ed course, and B.Ed course is where we produce teachers for the school education, which really shapes up the personality. So that is, if the shaping of personality is not done, then little precious can be done at higher education level as far as that aspect is concerned. So therefore, B.Ed is a very important course. And I remember I was on a panel discussion maybe 20 years ago or 18 years ago. Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi was also co-panelist when he was education minister. And I made a statement, sir, we are producing B.Ed graduates, but we are not producing teachers. He said, Professor Agarwal, very strong statement. I said, am I wrong, sir? He says, no. So therefore, in that scenario, Professor Kumaravel has innovatively tried to improve the things. So let's hear his views on this important aspect. Welcome, Professor Kumaravel.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible to?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Yeah. So good evening, and Professor Agarwal, Professor Jaspal, and Professor Farkun Kumar. It's my pleasure as well as my privilege to associate myself with this program. And I would like to record my appreciation as well as my sincere thanks to the organizers of the Association of Indian Universities for organizing this very relevant program at a right time, and also giving me this opportunity to associate myself with stalwarts and towering personalities like Professor Agarwal, Professor Jaspan Sandhu, and Professor Farkun Kumar. And my presentation will be logical conclusion of what Professor Jaspal Sandhu and Professor Farkun Kumar has already told. And Professor Jaspal Sandhu has rightly pointed out the very key role to be played by the leadership in Indian universities, the vice chancellors. And many cases we find we have trial and error administration by many vice chancellors. Like new teachers learning teaching in the classrooms through trial and error method of teaching. It happens in some universities that some new vice chancellors who are not trained in educational administration, who are not exposed to governance, or who are not well versed in the nuts and bolts of excellence in higher education, excellence in administration, they learn the skill of administration, they learn the art and science of administration, and by the time they complete their learning, the 3-year term is over or the 5-year term is over. So that way, it is very essential that, as Professor Farquhar Umar has rightly pointed out, benchmarking effective governance in higher education is very, very essential. What are the parameters, the criteria with which
We lost Professor Kumaravel.
He is there, but we are not able to see him. Maybe some connection issue.
Cannot hear him. I think he just got disconnected.
We can ask Professor Sandhu, what does he do when something like this happens in his university? Sir, Sandhu sir, we are saying we should ask Professor Sandhu, what does he do when something like this happens in his university?
See, in my own house, the net doesn't work. So we are now laying up new cables. It will work subsequently, but most of the students, we tell them, you buy a dongle, run their own show. That's a better option than going for that.
But is he working from AIU? He had joined from AIU only?
Yes, I think he joined from AIU from the guest house.
Then maybe some other point in AIU, because we can see you and
I think he will join shortly.
He
In the
started
meantime,
next-
Professor Sandhu, many people are asking that if you are saying 10% you get from the government, then how do you mobilize the rest of it?
See, we are the charging the maximum fees among all universities in North India. This is one. But we had to sell it. We had to sell it. The
Nee, but
quality has to be so good. See,
Sir, fee
I-
constitutes what percentage of your revenue?
Pardon?
Fee constitutes what percentage of
About 30% of it.
30?
And then my dear friend Professor Furqan Kamar was very right in saying that these affiliated colleges give us the money. So once they get out, we are done with. That's why I didn't bring it up, but he was right. So we have about 3.5 lakh students. They contribute some part of it into the university kitty. But we get lots of funds from CSR otherwise. See, what we have done is that we limited our expenses to the bare running of the university. Most of the development in the university, you come over and see the university, but you will find it's entirely different. President Dr. Subramanian, Mr. Subramanian came, Secretary MHRD was stunned to see the way. But the only thing is that funding is not for development. We don't use the university funds. We are using the funds from CSR. So then you had to have connection with the industry. You had to mobilize them. You had to request them. You had to beg of them. Actually, all vice chancellors, they become, when you are secretary UTC, you are a giver. When you are a vice chancellor, you are a beggar. So that's the only difference.
Oh, yes.
okay, I think we have Professor
We have,
Kumaravala back. No?
Yes.
Yeah, please continue.
He is doing screen sharing.
Yeah.
So can I continue my presentation, sir?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, please continue.
So my presentation will focus on benchmarking effective government education. The new education policy 2020 envisions funding of higher education based on performance and accountability. Effective governance that enables the culture of excellence in higher education is the foremost recommendation. So it is in the backdrop of the recommendation of the new education policy 2020, linking funding of higher education with performance and accountability. I am making a presentation. So benchmarking is a systematic process of measuring the university's output against the recognized best in the higher education sector. And Evans 2013 defines benchmarking as measuring own performance against best-in-class institutions to determine how they achieve their performance levels and use the knowledge to improve own performance. Klein 2014, benchmarking is an excellent tool to use in order to identify a performance goal. And the benefits of benchmarking: number one, it helps universities and colleges to understand their own strengths and weaknesses, their relative standing, where they are, and how far they have to go further. And it helps better satisfy the students' needs by establishing new standards and new goals. And benchmarking motivates faculty to reach new standards and to be keen on new developments. It allows universities to realize what levels of performance is really possible by looking at others. And benchmarking documents reasons as to why differences in institutional effectiveness exist. Why some universities are most effective, some universities are not that much effective. Why some colleges have got A++ grade and some other colleges have not that much successful. So all these things, the differentiating factors, the critical factors which differentiate an effective institution from an ineffective institution can be known by benchmarking, and it helps universities improve their competitive advantage. And benchmarking is a cost-effective and time-efficient way of establishing a pool of innovative ideas. So we have to ask 4 questions. What should we benchmark? Whom should we benchmark? How do we perform the process? And how do they perform the process? And the benchmarking process has 2 stages. First one is benchmarking standards we have to lay down in terms of how much of gap is there, where is the gap, and when does the gap come in, and what is the commitment of the university, how it communicates and resolves that issue, and how faculty participate and resolve to reduce the gap. So that way, how to close the gap between the expected output and the actual output. in terms of improvement in knowledge, improvement in practices, and improvement in process. So the benchmarking process has 5 stages. Decide what to benchmark. Identify the benchmarking partners. Gather information. Analyze and implement. Adapt, improve. So many countries, cross-cultural comparison and inter-country comparisons show that many countries share common concerns about the performance of their higher education systems and would like to learn how well their systems are performing in comparison to others. Cross-country comparisons through the international benchmarking of different higher education systems will enable countries to learn more about their strength and weakness, to provide a laboratory for others by identifying what works in higher education in their context. Benchmarking higher education system performance will contribute towards improvement across different higher education systems. So benchmarking dimensions, we have 5 dimensions in terms of the context, in terms of resources, in terms of education, in terms of research, and in terms of engagement. So when we go to the conceptual framework of governance, governance means the systems and procedures of oversight implemented by the higher education authority with regard to the individual higher education institutions and to the collective system of higher education. The objective of such oversight is to ensure that higher education institutions and the system collectively meet the outcomes expected effectively as well as efficiently. So when we go to the pillars of higher education, the higher education authority operates in a multi-stakeholder environment with number 1, the Ministry of Education, number 2, the higher education institutions, number 3, the academic and financial auditing agencies as the core pillars within the framework. So we have the multiple roles and responsibilities of the main actors of excellence in education. The Ministry of Education sets policy, identifies objectives and outcomes, and it determines funding. The Higher Education Authority, like UGC, oversees compliance with governance requirements, ensures accountability for funding, works with the higher education institutions to resolve governance issues. The higher education institutions, like universities and colleges, with their institutional autonomy, with their governing body responsibility, like Executive Council, Syndicate, Academic Council, Board of Studies, and so many statutory bodies, they realize the institutional objectives as well as the national objectives. And ultimately, the financial discipline is ensured by the Comptroller and Auditor General in terms of the system of external controls and accountability for public funding. So we have the 5 stakeholders: higher education institution employees, higher education institutions, higher education authority, Ministry of Education, Comptroller and Audit General, and the way in which they interact with each other, the symbiotic, the complementary and supplementary role, the interaction between them, the communication between them, to what extent each gets feedback and to what extent they modify themselves, fine-tune themselves on the basis of the feedback, on the basis of the extent of realization of objectives. So that decides the excellence in the governance system of higher education. And it is very essential to look at the dramatic changes in education over the recent decades. We see expansion of tertiary education systems. In 1991, the students' population was just 68 million. In 2004, it got almost doubled, I should say. 132 million students enrolled in tertiary education. Participation rates in tertiary education has become the benchmark. Then we have the diversification of provision. New institution types have emerged. Educational offerings within the institutions have multiplied, and private provision has expanded. New modes of delivery have emerged, more flexible ways of provision, distance learning, e-learning, mobile learning, all these things have developed. And more heterogeneous student bodies. Female participation has increased, more number of mature students. Student bodies are also heterogeneous in terms of socio-economic background, in terms of diversity in ethnicity, and in terms of previous entry behavior. The growing internationalization of higher education, the increasing applications of Web 2 technologies and social media are leveraging knowledge production. All these things have implications, tremendous implications in ensuring quality governance in higher education. And we have an additional factor. We talk about establishment of world-class universities in India and the critical governance features which are identified to establish world-class universities. See, we talk about national ranking, international ranking, which have added to the pressure on university governance. And we have NAAC assessment and accreditation, and we have tripartite evaluation. In central universities, they undergo quarterly assessment and accreditation every 3 months. We have to submit on the basis of the MOU we signed between UGC, Ministry of Education, and the central universities like Central University of Tamil Nadu. So we have to report every 3 months to what extent we have attained the benchmarks in identified parameters, some 21 parameters. And then autonomy that allows institutions to manage their resources capably and to quickly respond to the demands of a rapidly changing global market, which is essential, even though it is alone not sufficient to establish and maintain world-class universities. Other crucial governance features are needed, such as inspiring leadership, persistent leadership, a strong strategic vision, a visionary leadership with institutional direction, leadership with a philosophy of success, a philosophy of excellence, and a culture of constant reflection, organizational learning, and organizational change. And last but not the least, we have accountability. Autonomy and accountability are the two sides of the coin of governance. Accountability is the demonstration of value for money. Taxpayers' money, paupers' money, poor man's money. So it is very essential that institutions ensure social accountability, ensures responsible and relevant activities undertaken with the taxpayers' money, greater transparency and public accountability, guaranteeing academic quality and academic standards, ensuring equitable student admission procedures, which are transparent, and accessibility for students from poor families, reaching the unreached, from the have-nots, downtrodden, and ensuring an appropriate use of public funds within institutions with internal efficiency are a few benchmarks. Accountability can be ensured through various means, including quality assurance frameworks, performance-related funding, and participation of stakeholders in governance bodies, quality teaching, participation of student bodies, new students, what we call as digital migrants. We senior teachers are digital migrant category, but the emerging students are digital natives. The digital natives call for new digital methodologies. And it is essential that we teachers have to tune ourselves, cope up ourselves to the changing styles of the emerging netizens of 21st century. The governments, the students, their families, parents, employers, fund providers increasingly demand value for their money and desire more efficiency through teaching. So outcome indicators which are very essential as benchmarks: alumni satisfaction, student satisfaction, community satisfaction, annual income from parents, distribution of enrollment, state-wise diversity, international students, presence of formal ties to industry, job placement rate of students in occupational vocational programs, number of patents per faculty, and benchmark criteria for social relevance. What are the mechanisms within the university? Is there any mechanism in the university to establish a consensus on strategic priorities for regional development? Is there any mechanism in the university to link existing regional activities and add social values to them? Is there any mechanism existing within the university to balance its different geographical roles and create synergy between them? What mechanisms exist within the university to consider social issues such as health, culture, economy, community regeneration in a joined-up way? What mechanisms are established to bring together those involved in social development process, such as government agencies and community groups, so that they can prioritize which regional needs should be addressed? So continuous governance development model has to be there in every institution, starting with vision as a base, followed by guiding principles, setting qualification standards and learning goals with standard curriculum and standard learning activities, followed by standard assessment procedures, excellence in monitoring and recording, and ultimately it leads to effective governance, accreditation, evaluation, and engagement. So my concluding observation is that we cannot be mere consumers of good governance. We must be participants and we must be co-creators. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kumarbil, for a very exhaustive presentation on benchmarking in particular, because you obviously need something to look forward to, and that's what you projected. I also like your concept of continuous governance models, because it has to continue changing, and therefore things have to be adaptive. Your starting phrase about trial and error vice chancellors was interesting. I think while I fully endorse your spirit, but I think trial will be necessary even if you can make errors once a while, but it should not be trial and error repeatedly. So as they say that if you can make same mistake twice, that's dangerous. But if you can think of new mistakes by new initiatives, that's perfectly fine. So with these words, I think we almost listened to everybody. Now, if there are any questions from anybody, we can take some 10 minutes. Professor Farzan Mustafa has, yeah. Unmute yourself, please. Professor Farzan, yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, thank you so much for summing up in a perfect way in few sentences. Gagar mein sagar bhar diya aapne, Chairman sir. I entirely agree with you that in a country of our size and the number of universities we have, we can't be riding on old horses all the time. We need to make mistakes and we need to give chance to other people. I'm in entire agreement. But one issue of governance I want to raise here, and I would request Dr. Pankaj Mittal to put it before GC, that for the Association of Indian Universities, when it comes to president and vice president, then even if there is a break in somebody's tenure as VC, But there are people who had a break of 10 years or a break of 2 years. Still that break is not counted. I think for preparing All India seniority, we need to look at the continuous service as a vice chancellor. Once somebody has a break, he goes out of net. Then after 2 years, 3 years, if he again becomes vice chancellor, he has to start afresh. And when this GC rule was made initially, we had very small number of universities. And many people working in public universities, were not finding time to devote to AIU activities. Now AIU is dominated by about 300 private universities. We have over 800 universities, 700 plus our members. So Professor Furqan is also here. I think that this rule requires a review by the GC, so that because you have people who have put in more than 10 years continuous uninterrupted service, just because someone was a VC a decade ago, you can't be giving a seniority to him today.
Okay. I leave that for Dr. Pankaj Mittal and the member vice chancellors to debate about. I'm not a vice chancellor at the moment, so I don't even have a voting right on the subject.
But Dr. Saab, if time permits, Faizan Saab, I did follow.
Professor Furqan Qamar wants to come in to respond to some of the things.
Faizan Saab, perhaps I did not follow your question. You are saying that if there is a break, then the seniority should not be counted, because if I remember correctly, the rule is that every time a person has been vice chancellor of a member university, even though intermittently there have been gaps, so irrespective of the gap, the seniority is counted.
I think that is wrong, sir.
Achha, okay.
So I'm saying if there is a gap, you go out of the net.
No, that's
so
his
you want that. Okay.
That's all. Professor Furqan, there is a question in the chat box for you. I don't think it really is understood properly. It says the question is to Professor Qamar. He said a single higher education commission cannot handle approval of multiple disciplines. What is his suggestion?
No, in fact, this question was from Mr. Nagaraj Ramarao, and I think I also responded to him in the chat box. I did not say that the single regulator would not work. What I said was that many commissions and committees have been arguing for a single regulator because multiplicity of the regulatory agencies have been creating problem. But first, health and law have been separated, and within health, there have been separate commission for various kinds of health education on the ground that a specific type of health education cannot be handled by a common health commission. That is making people ask this question that higher education is also very diverse. So the point I said was that this is what is happening, that on the one hand, we talk about a single regulator, but we have created multiplicity in the health sector. If we have created multiplicity in the health sector, then this whole argument for higher education becomes some kind of a questionable argument. So that is the point that I mentioned, but I am not in favor of multiple regulators.
Yeah.
If time permits, can I ask you one question?
Yeah, sure. Please come in.
Sir, this in the governance, most of the universities, I feel that are highly vice chancellor centric. Even pro vice chancellors has no specific roles. So how far our decentralization and delegation will be effective in governance?
Who would like to take it up?
Sure.
Okay,
sure.
I think your question is valid.
Governance.
Yeah, but it will be the example which you have given, vice chancellor centric. Yes, university system is vice chancellor centric system, and I think it will remain so. But that does not mean delegation is not possible, not desirable, not done. There are several cases of vice chancellors where effective delegation has been done for quite well. For that matter, if I want to take a name, Delhi University, for example, I think Pro Vice Chancellor has more workload than the Vice Chancellor. This is what I have found while making a study. So it will depend upon university to university, but I think there is nothing wrong in Vice Chancellor being the central pivot of a university, because unless you own the university, you really cannot deliver to the extent one can. Professor Sandhu just gave a case study of his university. Unless he starts believing that this university is mine, this may be good or bad, but then you cannot deliver out of the box till you have that feeling. But that still does not mean that you cannot delegate, you will not delegate, you will not decentralize. So that will be for the Vice Chancellor to devise a system how it can be done. I don't think a central legislation on this will be good enough, because we do not even have a central legislation on whether to have a PBC or not. There are universities which don't have a PBC. There are universities which have multiple PBCs. There are universities which can have multiple registrars. So so one hand we want autonomy. So I think let each Vice Chancellor decide how to decentralize to the best interest of the university. That's my take, but anybody else wants to comment? Professor Mustafa wants to say something.
Sir, I just want to take forward what Professor Furqan Kamal was saying. I think under some mistaken belief, legal education is not proposed to be included in the proposed Higher Education Commission. Now, as per the Advocates Act, Bar Council of India has a very limited window. It can regulate only registration of advocates to practice. Therefore, what should come under Bar Council of India's jurisdiction is only professional legal education, not LLM or PhD or higher education as such. I think the proposed Higher Education Commission should certainly have a vertical on law as well, so that we can have a centralized uniform policy making for entire higher education. And I would also like to say that many people are confused as if BCI is like Medical Commission or erstwhile Medical Council of India. The appropriate comparison of BCI would be with the IMA, Indian Medical Association. It is a body of professional lawyers. It is not a regulator. The regulator of the legal education ideally should be UGC, or a legal education commission should come in, or a vertical in the new commission. And as far as governance, the earlier point we were discussing, many vice chancellors, sir, are hesitant in trusting their pro-vice chancellor. Because in one case, I had to argue in Allahabad High Court, where the pro-vice chancellor had become anti-vice chancellor and he was removed. Then he challenged the removal in the High Court. So I had just jokingly written in the reply on behalf of the vice chancellor that he has become anti-vice chancellor. And the judge ignored all other points, and he said, your post is PVC, you have to be pro-vice chancellor. How come you have become anti-vice chancellor? So that is a kind of experience.
When if you're leaving pro-vice chancellor as an empty person, so he get a lot of time to act against vice chancellor.
Right.
So better to give some of the designations, or some of the things can be transferred.
Actually,
So I used to do what I used to do, other than the mandatory committee by the University Grant Commission. All other committees are chaired by pro-vice chancellor.
Okay, good. Professor Sandhu wanted to say something.
Mr. Chair,
Sir, Dr. Mustafa was very clear about the BCI, but I am also Vice Chancellor of a law university, sir, dual charge, unfortunately, which I don't want to be, but I am. They started a new state law university near my place, sir, so I am Vice Chancellor of that university also. Sir, I went to BCI, sir. You cannot run a course. You are right, they are the only registering body. But what actually is happening, sir, that they want, you cannot start a course for next 3 years in law unless you seek permission of BCI. You know, LLM was never under BCI because they were registering, they've only talked. Now they put LLM also under it, sir. That is the state of, see, same is happening with SPS. Despite the fact these both are registering bodies, but they're technically acting as regulating bodies. Unless they are put in their place, this is going to continue as multi-councils and multi-problems which we are having, they're still going to continue. SPA does the same and PCI does the same.
I would agree with Professor Sandhu. This is not only with BCI, this is Architecture Council says the same thing. They are meant for only registering the architects, but they are entering into architecture education. Pharmacy Council does the same thing. So, right perspective is what Professor Mustafa is saying, but how to put the right perspective in right practice, that's a big question. But the national policy of education clearly says except for legal and architecture education. Now, I don't know whether under the circumstances, Higher Education Commission of India, which will be incorporated as a part of NPE, will cover legal education or not. That is yet to be seen, because policy clearly says except for legal education and medical education. Well, maybe Dr. Sandhu is a medical professional here and Dr. Mustafa is a legal profession here. Why national policy education framers wanted to keep you out, your domains of education out, is beyond my comprehension. Because if unification is the merit, then unification is the merit.
Correct.
If separation is a merit, then separation is a merit. We must first accept whether unification is the name of the game of the country which will play, or diversification is the name of the game. This mixed kind of thing will not take us anywhere, because between medical and others, say for example, whether pharmacy should belong to medical or non-medical has been a question mark for years together. AICT has been trying to control pharmacy, which is much more akin to medical education. So the biotechnology, will it be called a technology or medical course? So these problems will remain unless we take a real bold step. If we are doing integration, everything is integrated. I think that is what Professor Furqan Qamar said. And I also personally agree with it, without understanding the reason of keeping the legal and medical out of it. But then that is the policy as of now. Any other question?
A couple of things. I think one aspect has also been omitted perhaps somehow in the policy. There are many countries where medical education as such is not regulated. It is the people who come out of the medical schools, they are tested. Now in India, they have also introduced an exit test. So once they have introduced this exit test, so then I think the regulation of the education should be left to the regulatory bodies in higher education. But anyway, the policy did not consider that fit, or there is also no discussion on this issue. On this issue of the governance that Professor Sudhir raised, that the universities have become vice chancellor centric. Actually, technically speaking, if you look at the Act and Statutes of the university, the Act and Statutes of the universities do not provide so. There the powers are vested in the Executive Council and the Academic Council and various other decision-making bodies. Although, like Professor Faizan Mustafa Sahab said, that it so happened that these ECs and the Board of Management and Academic Council, by whatever name they are called, they have become kind of a body which simply stamp what the Vice Chancellor says. So this tells that perhaps the Vice Chancellors have become all the powerful individuals and institutions in the university. But the sad reality is that this is not the case. You will find the Vice Chancellors themselves also very, very vulnerable and subject to accountability and answerability to many other organizations. So I think you need to see things perspective. On a lighter side, addressing to Faizan Sahab, there was also a joke around, sir, that there was a delegation of international universities visiting India. So they visited one university and they stayed there on campus for 3 days. On the third day, the Vice Chancellor hosted a dinner. And on the dinner, the Vice Chancellor was introducing the delegation, all the officers of the university, so Dean of Student Welfare and Proctor and Dean, so on and so forth. And then he said, he is Professor so-and-so, he is pro-Vice Chancellor. And this international delegation head said, oh, thanks God, you have at least one person in your university who is pro-vice chancellor. Because for the last 3 days, we have been meeting people who are all anti-vice chancellor. So I think the reality is not black and white. The reality is gray, and that need to be addressed. I think the solution is not UGC or any other regulatory body imposing some more law. The solution lies in strengthening these institutions, the decision-making bodies, and the composition of these bodies within the universities.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, sir. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? We can take one or two more, or otherwise close the session. Okay, friends, I think there are no further questions. Maybe time factor makes it happen that way. But I must thank all the panelists for very, very interesting session, very interesting observations, very meaningful concepts thrown on the floor of the house. And I would like to thank Geetam University and Association of Indian Universities, Dr. Pankaj Mittal and our team for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this session. It was a great session with great ideas. How much of it is translated, time will tell, but that's what we have debated, what we were supposed to. And I once again thank Professor Jaspal Singh Sadhu, Professor Furqan Kamar, and Professor Karpaga Kumaravil for very, very interesting and meaningful observations. Governance is a continuous question. It will continue to remain. And as I said in the beginning, National Policy of Education has given us so much flexibility that unless we have decision taking at all levels, this flexibility will not be able to be effectively made use of. And therefore, delegation, decentralization, autonomy will have to be integral parts of implementation of national education policy. Otherwise, who is going to decide which subject student, can it be left 100% freely to the student? I asked a question other day, a student says, I'll study physics, music, cricket, and history. Now, what degree will we give him? So there will have to be some structure even within the freedom, and freedom cannot be absolute. Structuring should not be very rigid, and we will have to play in between the two. And as a computer science professional, I always give an example of internet. Internet has millions and billions of computers connected to it. Nobody is the owner. Everybody has the same rights to use, but still it is a perfectly disciplined system. You type a comma wrong and it doesn't allow you to move. So freedom coupled with some sort of structure will have to be the name of the game which we'll have to play in governance. With these words, I thank the panelists and all the attendees, and I'm so happy that I started with the number 42 on roll to start with, and it remains 42. Normally, vice chancellors have not been attending the sessions, particularly the last session, but the 42 remains steady. That's a very, very healthy sign of the vice chancellors taking part in constructive debates and taking it forward, because ultimately linchpin of the academic system will continue to be vice chancellor. I have no doubt about it. With this, I once again thank AIU and Geetam University and close this session from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the very interesting, enriching, and insightful session. Ladies and gentlemen, the curtain draws to a close for the first day's deliberations. We will see you tomorrow for the second day session on financing of higher education, followed by valedictory session. Thank you so much for tuning in to AIU's South Zone Vice Chancellors Meet 2021. And thank you for your time. And we shall see you right back here at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.